We'll see how far we get. 1 Timothy chapter 5, starting in verse 3. I'm going to read the whole section, but I do not promise that we will be able to finish. Starting in verse 3 and reading through verse 16. Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in petitions and prayers night and day. But she who lives in self-indulgence is dead, even while she lives. And command these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in affliction, if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation, because they have set aside their previous pledge. And at the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no opportunity for reviling, for some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing woman has widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Well, we have seen in the book of 1 Timothy, because indeed it was a book to Timothy, a young man in a pastor-like role in the church of Ephesus, that the contents of this letter is not just for pastors, it's for the church, because it is about the truth. And one of the truths that have come to the surface as we have read 1 Timothy and we're preaching through it is the church is the household of God. It's called the family of the living God in chapter 3, verse 15. The reflections of the family nature of the church are evident when we see Paul giving instructions about the relationships between members and even the relationships between Christians and their family members. You consider what Paul says about the officers of the church, and he gives qualities that sort of indicate that you could imagine, in one sense, pastors being paternal, like protectors of the church. You can imagine, in one sense, those who are serving in the office of deacon, that they're serving in a maternal-like fashion, that they're carrying in material and mercy ministries of the body. And in that sense, we see the church being understood not only in a symbolic way, but in a functional and relational way to actually act like a family. We also find instruction, as we alluded to earlier with my address to Robert, that older men and women are to receive a certain kind of honor, and younger men and women are to be understood relative to their age. Again, reflecting the family and the way the church is ordered, even in the way we speak to one another. I think it's indeed beautiful, and I just want the children to understand that I am probably the biggest fan of you being in church. You're probably not as big a fan of it as I am. But it is beautiful to have children present with the church in worship. not because there's some kind of sacramental effect that is happening to you. No, you're warring with your parents in the pew, just as you might war privately somewhere else, all right? And it is what it is. But nonetheless, there is a portrait there that I think is helpful for children, for you to understand. And we could just visually look around the room. Just take note, children, what color of hair do we have? We have silver hair and red hair and dark hair and blonde hair and skin for hair. And in that sense, this sort of shows age and sex. Age and sex. Children, this is a picture of the church. The church is made up of men and women, boys and girls, and it's made up of old and young and those in the middle. This is God's family, and it operates like a family. And I love that I can give the visual illustration of the family of God by having people of different ages and sexes in our congregation. But we also are able to understand that the family gives to us, in one sense, our highest pleasures and our deepest sorrows. You will never be happier than when you are rejoicing with your family at a wedding, the birth of a child or a grandchild. And you will never be sadder than when you lay one of your family members' lifeless body into the grave. The church is a family. Are we ever happier than at baptisms? And in one sense, we are happy when our brothers and sisters go home to be with the Lord, but we are also uniquely sad because we're a family, God's household. And one of the things that happens in households is that you will bury your spouses. Every single one of you will be a widow or a widower if you marry. It's very rare that you would die at the same time. Here, Paul gives instruction to the household of God about how to deal with widows. The reason that he addresses widows and not widowers is because a widower, a man who has lost his wife in a temporary fashion to death, he can still work. He has means of being able to protect and provide for himself. But in the time of the New Testament, it was much more difficult for a widow to provide and protect herself. She was extremely vulnerable. And in one sense, we have indeed developed things that enable widows to be much better off today. But that does not change the reality that widows today are still vulnerable in a way that widowers are not. Widows today are still more vulnerable, more in need of others to provide and protect them than a widower would be. And while statistically, most husbands will precede their wives in death, practically, the Bible gives us instruction about how should we respond, how should we live in this world as God's household, given that indeed there will be great joys and there will also be the great sadness of husbands preceding their wives in death. Now, there are discussions about whether Paul was addressing a particular cataclysmic earthquake or famine that might have brought about a dramatic uptick in the number of widows in the region. If that is the case, then it would obviously make sense why he would address it, but none of the circumstances that Paul is addressing seem to be circumstantial in its argument. And so I don't think that this is given to us as to write off as a unique circumstance to the church at Ephesus because of famine or earthquake. I think Paul's argument here is on the basis of our faith and the kind of order God has given to the family, and how the church should respond when that order isn't available for certain widows. And he calls that widows indeed. That's the technical term that Paul uses in 1 Timothy chapter 5, 3 through 16, to understand who are the church's widows, cared for, protected, and provided by the church itself. And so in one sense, in our day and age, we have walked away from the order that God has baked into creation, and that is children and grandchildren are responsible to care for their widows. But what about when you do not have children or grandchildren? Now, there are a lot of circumstances that I'm not going to be able to address in the incredibly short amount of time that we have today. And so I think many things you probably should seek counsel from the elders of our church. But we are able to understand Paul and the Holy Spirit gives sweeping general instructions for us to understand how does God's family care for her true widows. Who provides this care? What makes one qualified to receive this care? This portion of Scripture gives to us practical instructions for how God's family cares for her widows. Now, again, we have Social Security for now. We have investments that some of you have made, and they are maybe reaping a return, and you're hoping they will have some money set aside for you. Some of you have 401ks through your business. Some of you work for the government, and you presume there's no way the government wouldn't provide for me what they've promised. Now we laugh, and because it's a little better for us to laugh than to maybe say, hopefully all of those things will be in place. But I'm not a crazy man to say there could be things that change it. So that no longer do we come to this passage and imagine like, wow, man, things were surely bad in Bible times. Glad I don't live there. I think this kind of instruction is helpful for us as God's family to be able to see, yep, things indeed could go so bad that we are actually having to practically apply this passage for how are we going to navigate the fact that we're going to have more widows in the future. And widows are not like widowers. Well, this passage gives us instruction, and from this passage we'll be able to see 3 necessities to honor true widows. 3 necessities for us, that is, as the church, as God's household, 3 necessities for us to honor true widows through material care and ministry commitment. Do need to define 2 words. Number 1, honor. We need to talk about honor, because this honor is referring to something that is different than the honor that Paul was referring to in the way that you would speak to an older man as a younger pastor, the way that you would speak to an older woman as a younger pastor. That kind of honor was a way in showing respect in the manner in which you speak and address someone. This honor, verse 3, see the command? Honor. This is going to be the same kind of honor that is going to be, if you go over to verse 17 in the same chapter, the elders who lead well are to be considered worthy of double honor. This honor in verse 3, this command to honor widows who are widows indeed, is referring to material provision. Elders who, we'll get there, but elders who are considered worthy of double honor, that those who, especially who labor in preaching the word and teaching, that's referring to material provision. Here, the command is for material provision to be given to widows indeed. That is the command. That is the instruction. And so we need to understand in verse 3, the command, church, Timothy is telling you, you need to provide material provision or material care for true widows. Now, what Paul goes on to talk about, and this is the second term, is okay, then what is a widow indeed? What is a true widow? What is a widow who actually can be listed on this widow's sheet that receives material care? This true widow, let me say what she is not. A true widow, a widow indeed, is not someone who is just technically a widow. If your husband precedes you in death, you are a technical widow. That is not the qualification of being a widow indeed. A widow indeed is also not someone who is young enough to remarry. Again, technically, you are a widow. Paul will give instructions to those who are young enough to remarry, and that would not be, in Paul's technical language, a widow indeed, or a true widow for the church's material care. Paul is also not addressing a woman whose husband has died, but still has living children or grandchildren. Now, technically, she is a widow. But Paul says she's not a widow indeed. She's not a candidate to be put on the church's widow list. We also see that a woman who is a widow in a technical sense, but has disregarded her ministry to the church and her character in the past. So her failure to minister to the church in the past and her failure to develop godly character disqualifies her from being a widow indeed. A true widow, that is, the widow who could be a candidate to be put on the church's list of material care. Here are the three necessities that we learn from this passage for us as the church, God's household, to be able to understand who might we provide material care when one's husband precedes them in death. First, for us to understand this, we need to encourage that families need to care for their widows. That's point number one. We need to encourage families to care for their widows. If you look at verse 4, Paul gives this disqualifies someone from being a widow indeed. If any widow has children or grandchildren. Whoa, I thought the commandment is children are called to honor their father and mother. Well, here we find the Apostle Paul taking God's moral demand for families such that indeed children are responsible to care for their parents. That is a way that you show them honor, which is one of the distinctions if you're wondering, what do I do as an adult child to honor my mother and father? Well, it is not that you call them up and say, hey, Dad, it's Friday night. Can you give me a command so that I can obey you? Right? You don't obey your living parents as an adult child in the way you would if you were 4 or 5 or 12. But you do think, I honor them by providing for them. But Paul doesn't leave it at children. He now extends it to grandchildren. If any widow has children or grandchildren, they, who is the they? It's not the widows. It's the children and grandchildren. The children and grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents. This is acceptable in the sight of God, which is to say, it pleases him. And so if you are a child, my mother is a widow. And so what you need to understand is how would you be able to please God when you have a mother or grandmother who is a widow? You please God by providing for her. You please God by providing for her. Let's make sure we would understand. What Paul is instructing Timothy to do is that when families are being addressed and a widow comes to Timothy in the church at Ephesus, or Ephesus clearly had real widows there and some who weren't true widows, what would Timothy say to them? Timothy would say to the widow, you need to tell your children and grandchildren that you are their responsibility. Or if those children or grandchildren went into church, he would tell the children and grandchildren, she's your responsibility. She's not the church's responsibility. This is encouragement to families to care for their widows. The widows in your family, they're your widows. They're your widows. My mother is my widow. She's not the church's widow. Families please God when we care for our parents and grandparents. Please let that trickle down. That does not exist in our society. It pleases God when children and grandchildren care for their widows. God smiles. It's acceptable to him. In one sense, you can imagine you're holding up to God something that is pleasing service or worship to him. And what is it? It's you going to care or provide for your widow, your widowed mother, your widowed grandmother. Verse 8, Paul says, if anyone does not provide for his own, who is the own? In this case, the context is widowed mothers or widowed grandmothers. If you do not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Wow. So let's just make sure we're understanding what Paul is laying down here. If you presently, Christian, are not caring for your widowed mother or your widowed grandmother, meaning she's destitute, she doesn't have the provision necessary for her, and you refuse to care for your widowed mother or your widowed grandmother, what does Paul say that you are worse than? An unbeliever. Whoa. I mean, like, how do you even conceptualize worse than someone who rejects the gospel? Worse than someone who refuses to yield to the testimony of the Holy Spirit, identifying Jesus, the Son of Mary, to be the Son of God, the Messiah of Jew and Gentile. You mean I'm worse than that person because I am not caring for my widowed mother and grandmother? Look at verse 8. Yes, you are. This is encouragement. This is encouragement for all of us that we are to care for our widows, our widowed mothers, our widowed grandmothers. We please the Lord when we do this, and we do not have the church confused about a responsibility to care for them. This is the principle of moral proximity, and it falls first to the family. So what should we understand as a church? We should understand that we encourage families to care for their own widows. Number two, we need to open the widows list to qualified godly widows. Verses 4 through 6 are indicating, indeed, this who could be on the list, and 9 through 10 talk about who can be on the list. Having said what a true widow is not, Paul describes what this true widow is. This widow, indeed, the candidate to be on the church's list of widows to receive material care. Right here, we're able to see verse 5, if she has been left alone, if she's fixed her hope on God, if she continues in petitions and prayers night and day, if she is not someone who is self-indulgent, then she could be a widow indeed. So ungodly widows are not candidates for the church's material care. Widows who have not given themselves to the ministry of the church, and that means the people of the church, the works of the church, then she would not be qualified to be on the widow's list. Let's also look at verses 9 and 10. A widow is to be put on the list. I think that is necessary for us to understand. It's not like a list, it is a particular list. The list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. Having a reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in affliction, if she has devoted herself to every good work. This is the widow who is qualified to be on the church's list of material care for widows. I think when we think about the list, we need to think of it in a similar fashion, that if you were to take our church's list of who are the elders who are responsible for working more than the other elders. It's Peter and me. Peter and I. So you rightly see on our church's budget, there's a line item that talks about the honor that the church gives to me and Peter. Peter and I, however I'm supposed to say that. You can tell me at lunch. Likewise, this list of widows would have a line item on the budget, and you would be able to say, and she receives this, and she's on this list, and she's a part of this, all right? It is equivalent to those pastors who we call vocational pastors or staff pastors. She is exemplary in character, she is proven in ministry, and she has offered herself to serve in a particular role in the church that sustains certain ministries of the church, and it does come with financial remuneration. That is what Paul is describing here in verse 10. It also says something about her previous relationship to her husband. What kind of woman was this? She's a one-man woman. She was devoted to her husband when he was alive. This kind of woman is the kind of woman who trusts God to provide for her, and that's evident in her prayer. She's the kind of woman that gave herself to the service of the church. She's not selfish. She's not hedonistic. This is the kind of woman who, when she is above the age of remarriage and yet she lives above reproach, she's not wandering around from person to person, from house to house, from event to event, gossiping and drinking too much wine. She's industrious with her hands. You could say, can you please show me your schedule? And when she showed you how she uses her time, you would see the execution of a godly life. You would not see a hedonistic, pleasure-seeking woman. You would see a woman in active service to others with godly character defining that service. She's known by her good deeds to the church and to the family. She has, if God gave her children, she brought them up. For the strangers and new people in her life, she welcomes them. For the church, she serves them. To those who are in need, she sought to give to them, and she is persistent in these good works. This is not a flash in the pan. This is the pattern of this woman's life. That is the widow who would meet the qualifications to be on the church's list of material provision. So just imagine here, because here's where this also kind of can like explode some of our categories, all right? So imagine a widow walks into the church at Ephesus. They have a receptionist and a secretary. I'm joking. They probably met in houses, all right? But they come here, they walk in, and they say, could I speak to Pastor Timothy? And they take him to his office and his study, the Holy of Holies, all right? And they go back in there, and she's meeting with him. The secretary is sitting in with them, and Timothy begins to ask this widow questions about her life. And it turns out she actually hasn't lived her life in service to the church, and her character has not been above reproach. And Timothy says, you don't qualify. And she says, but I'm a widow. Like, my children are sorry. They don't care about me. They don't give a rip that I am destitute and I am on the brink of homelessness. I mean, you're the church. I'm sorry, ma'am. You don't qualify. The church is not going to help you. Now, Christian, I just want you to say, like, does that cohere with your understanding of pastoral counseling? Does that cohere with the kind of conversation that might take place between pastors and the churches when they're considering who might the church assist? Or does that seem to be fundamentally not Christian to you? I would want us just work out practically what Paul is instructing Timothy about, such that if Timothy is in these conversations, if he is going to do what Paul actually says, verse 7, command these things as well. He's not only going to have to give potential widows, which this would be wives. It really matters how you live, doesn't it? It really matters how you live as a wife. It matters how you live as a wife. It matters how you live as a mother. It matters. Is it hard? Yes. Are you tired? Every night. Do you feel up to the task? Probably not. God will give you the grace, but it matters. It matters. Such that for those who didn't live that way, Timothy would say, I'm sorry, you don't qualify. And now she leaves, and the church does not provide for her. All of the consequences in the hardened world of the New Testament times would affect her life. And yet this is the instruction that Paul gives. The widow who qualifies for the church's material provision is indeed the kind of widow who has been a faithful servant of Christ to the family that God gave her, to the husband that God gave her, and to the church that God gave her. And if she is not this, she does not qualify. And here's our last one. This is 11 through 16. Paul gives extended encouragement for the younger widows to remarry. For the younger widows to remarry. I've referred recently here that when I was 30, I came down with Burkitt's lymphoma, and the oncologists told me, the best we can tell you that you may have a 50-50 shot at living. And Burkitt's lymphoma is rare, so they're like, we don't have a lot of data to be able to say much about Burkitt's lymphoma. But nonetheless, when you're told this by an oncologist, you're not a Looney Tune to think it's likely my wife will be a widow. So I have walked through at least 7 months of considering I'm going to die and my 31-year-old wife will be a widow. What instruction does God have for that widow? Well, here's instruction that Paul has for someone who would be incredibly sorrow. I mean, it's far easier, at least in my anecdotal illustration, to have to deal with your own death than to deal with the fact that your wife and your children may be fatherless and your wife a widow. Paul says in verse 11 that younger widows, they still have desires that only marriage can satisfy. Makes sense. Verse 11, refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires and disregard of Christ, they want to get married. Younger widows, they should seek to be remarried. What does that mean for men? You should consider widows as potential wives if you are not married. Duh. I gave a list. It was only 3. No, there was 3 men. I gave them a list of potential men that I thought would be good candidates for my wife. Now, obviously, that list will die with me and those 3 men. All right, but nonetheless, that indicates that when you are met with this tragedy of burying your husband when you are young, you just have to reckon with the fact that you are young enough to have desires which the widow's list is not going to be able to satisfy. Marriage satisfies. And so Paul is instructing Timothy, God's design is such that younger widows should not be put on this list because they cannot keep the pledge. This also indicates that this widow's list is not like, hey, I'm a widow, these are my qualifications, can I have money? Can I have bread? That's not the way the list worked. The list this is a ministry. This is like a vocational ministry that only qualified widows could partake in. So you would be making a pledge to fulfill your ministry as a widow on the list of the church. There were obligations that came with this, and it was a very serious matter if you didn't keep your obligations. So younger widows, Paul says, they should be refused from being on this list. It is necessary that you just reckon with the fact that, please reckon with the fact, as we will have many widows. And some of them will be young. Fathers, teach your boys, what are you looking for when you consider a woman to be your wife? You're looking for a godly woman. That's what you're looking for. You're looking for a godly woman. If she happens to be a widow, doesn't matter. If she's a godly woman, you should be looking at her. If you are a widow, I do pray we don't have to deal with this, but if you do, just please know that the pastors of our church will be praying that God will provide you a husband. But you can't be on the list. Younger widows also, different than the older widows, what do you have if you're a younger widow? You have time and strength. You have time and strength, right? You younger wives think, I don't feel like I have strength. Guess what? You do. You do. You have time and strength. And that's why it would be better for you to use your time and strength to be able to do things that are indeed pleasing to God. Verse 14, therefore I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no opportunity for reviling. This has incredible implications when you think about many women in our society today are being encouraged that you should not get married, and you should use the sort of from 20 to 40, that 2 decades of your life, which you will have the most strength, you will have the most ability. You should use that time for your career. You should use that time for being able to accomplish something of so-called significance. Because later on, you're not going to be able to do things like this. Guess what? The Bible says exactly the opposite. The Bible says that you should be looking to use the best, in one sense, strongest parts of your life. You should be using that for your family. You should use that for your family. Your children are not a waste of time. Your husband is not a waste of time. Your home, your house, your ministry from the household, it is not a waste of time. It is the best use of your time. That is why Paul is able to say to younger widows, no, you don't want to be on the list. You want to remarry. And from that marriage, you want to bear children, keep house, and that gives the enemy no opportunity. Right? So younger women, girls, young ladies, all right, you heard it here. Your father can take it up with me. The most significant thing that you could do, you don't get to do it, it's not a script, it's not a check you get to cash in, God has to provide it for you, is that you marry, you bear children, you keep house. It is an incredibly significant life. Now, if you talk to them, it may not seem so significant, all right? There's a lot of things that are incredibly mundane, and you may wonder, like, how is this significant? And yet it is, and yet it is. Verse 14, that is the reason that Paul gives these kinds of instructions to Timothy why younger widows are not allowed on the list. They have the ability and energy to serve a family and the husband, and they should do that. They should not be put on the list. Church, this is something that we may have to navigate. I anticipate that we probably will. But the Bible gives us instructions. As God's family, we are instructed on how it is that we should honor those who are widows indeed. Now, that's all we had time for and went a little far, but Jesse, if you'd come and lead us. If you have questions about what I've said, please come and talk to me.